Hello, students of European history. I'm a little bit melancholy, a little bit sad. Today is the very last lecture I will be presenting to you on YouTube. Wish that a lot of these lectures had been done live, but as you know, it is what it is. So today I'm going to talk to you about sort of a mismatch of topics going from religion to philosophy to women and art, sort of a grab bag here at the end. It's stuff that you probably have read about off and on in the last week or so, but I'll just kind of give you my take on things and maybe look at things in a kind of a larger scale when we're looking at religion or we're looking at women or looking at art, just kind of repeating some of the themes from earlier. When we're talking about Christianity in Europe in the 20th century and beyond, there really is a decrease in belief and a decrease in church attendance. There's got to be a number of different factors as to why that is the case. It could be World War I, World War II were so absolutely horrible that a lot of Europeans asked themselves, how could there be a God, or how could there be a good God if things like this are happening? Could also be that oftentimes right-wing governments, authoritarian right-wing governments, were supported by the church in Europe. You think about Franco's fascism, for example, or Mussolini's fascism. Both of those had the acquiescence of the church or the alliance of the church with the fascist states. And well, if you think about even Vichy France, also kind of a political Catholicism going on there, supporting the right-wing governments. That's a stain on the church that they're supporting those different movements. It also could be that the comforts of the welfare state reduce the need for people to either rely on the charity of the church or, hope for a better life in the afterlife. Their lives are fairly comfortable with the social welfare state, and so, praying for eternal salvation or things like that in heaven. They're getting a kind of material heaven in a way, just from the social welfare state. Same thing could be true of medical care in earlier centuries when people were faced with sickness, with illness, with death. They could pray for deliverance from those sorts of things. Now they just go to doctors and hopefully get healed. Could also be science and technology advancing to the point where the existence of God is called into question. It is, if you think about evolution or something like that, sometimes thinking that there is a God that created everything and who's listening and sort of creating miracles and things like that just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Also, when we get to the 1968 period and beyond, we have this kind of permissive society that says, if it feels good, do it, and live your own life, and don't be kept down by morals of somebody else or morals of a church, and people maybe just don't want to go to church or don't want to listen to the morality of the church if they want to live different kinds of lives, or if they have other things going on, whether it be getting divorced or being homosexual and those sorts of things, and the church is telling them that that's wrong. The permissive society is pushing back against that. And then communism. You think about all the people who became communists over the 20th century. Communism looks at religion as the opiate of the masses. They want to do away with religion. In fact, we're very successful in doing away with religion. Many of the places that became communist in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union don't really jump on board with religion after the Iron Curtain falls or after the walls come down and communism goes away. It just doesn't seem to be part of something that they want to jump into after religion had really been done away with. You can see here church attendance in Europe is really pretty low, especially when compared to the United States. And I like looking at this map because there are several states where church attendance is really quite high, and I think those tend to be Catholic states for cultural reasons, for historical reasons. These places are very Catholic Look, for example, at Ireland. Look, for example, at Poland. Look, for example, at Italy, and the rest of the states, and at Spain too, and Portugal to some extent. The rest of the states really have very low regular church attendance. The Catholic Church in particular changes in the 1960s. Even before that, there were these Christian democratic movements that comes really out of the 1890s. Leo XIII saying that Catholics should participate in democracy or should participate in the political process. And Christian Democrats during the 20th century were pushing for sort of Christian socialist values, trying to support the social welfare state, of course, not supporting socialism or communism in any way, shape, or form, but trying to do things that were good for the people. In the 1960s, there was a council, another church council, probably the second most important one after the Council of Trent, called the Vatican II Council. And the Catholic Church really changes. It becomes much more modern at that period of time, relatively late in history, where things that used to be all done in Latin during the Catholic Mass are now done in the vernacular, where the laity or the non-clergy are invited to participate in the Mass as well. It also, the Catholic Church also becomes ecumenical. That means it reaches out to other Christian faiths and no longer says about those other kinds of Christianity that the people who are Lutheran or Presbyterian or Anglican or whatever are damned to hell because they don't follow Catholicism. It becomes much more friendly towards other Christian movements. And it becomes much more international as well. Different parts of the world are recognized for being part of the church, and that leadership of people in Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia could be part of the church. In fact, the latest pope is from Argentina, the first South American pope ever elected by the cardinals. The Catholic Church, though, hasn't changed completely, and it's still very socially conservative, especially when it comes to things like women's issues, socially conservative when it comes to divorce, birth control, abortion, all of these kinds of things the Church is still very conservative on, and pushing governments and pushing people to uphold those sort of conservative values. John Paul II was a pope who you might remember was helping Eastern Europe free itself from communism, and also at the same time, John Paul II was pushing for much more socially conservative kinds of things as well. Moving away from the church and going into sort of the opposite of faith would be the philosophy of existentialism. And existentialism is a belief. There's a number of different people who supported this sort of belief, but the main proponent of existentialism is that guy right there, cigarette in hand, Jean-Paul Sartre. Existentialism is about how life is meaningless and life is absurd. The belief that there is reason or progress or God, the things that people believed in really darn near forever in European history, that all of that is just nonsense. There is no such thing as any of those things. We just are looking at history and looking at lives as if those things actually existed. Really, the only thing that exists is human beings, just human beings existing. And this is kind of a scary thought. Sartre talks about how man is condemned to be free. If there is no God, no progress, no reason or anything, you ask yourself, well, what's the point in living? Well, the point in living is to exist and to create meaning for yourself. Don't be anxious about this. Don't be anxious that there is no God. Don't be anxious that there is no progress or reason. You have to act, Sartre says. You have to choose. You have to exist. And by doing those things, by acting and choosing and existing, you're creating meaning, and your life then is worth living. That's kind of the way that a lot of people exist after World War II, this existentialism. There's a women's revolution, as you know, going on really throughout European history. We looked at the disadvantages of being women and how those things lessen over a very, very long period of time. Also in the 20th century, we saw the situation of women changing Because of war, women are needed in the home front, for example, in both world wars, and they've proved themselves to be as capable as men doing as the jobs that men can do equally as well, if not better. After the world wars, especially after World War II, during the so-called information age, we're beyond industrial revolutions. We're kind of in an information revolution. Then women truly can do anything that a man can do, and perhaps even better. Also, as time marched on in the 20th century, because of the social welfare state, and just because of modernity, women's lives became much less about motherhood. At one point in time, women were basically, as you know, in the second sphere just to be mothers of children. And now women are no longer pregnant for much of their lives. Women had lives outside of pregnancy with a declining birth rate. That was made possible by the birth control pill, which is invented in the 1960s and becomes a pretty easy means of controlling the number of births or controlling births altogether for women. And women, too, started to feel a kind of desire to get out of the second sphere, to live their own lives away from motherhood, away from just being a wife, for example. They really wanted psychological satisfaction by entering the first sphere and living their lives for themselves. In 1949, a woman by the name of Simone de Beauvoir, a French woman, if you can tell, wrote a book called The Second Sex, in which she talks about the things that we've talked about in this class, that women were in a second sphere, that women were inferior, women were the other when one thinks about how society treats them. And she says, because she is she's in a romantic relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre. She too is into existentialism. She says that really, women are free. Women can do whatever they want. They can act, they can choose, but they're trapped in a kind of role that history and society has given them. And so if thinking about existentialism, if women choose to act in a different way, if they take action, they can free themselves from the role of being the second sex. There's also an American woman a little bit later who writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. Her name is Betty Friedan, and she talks about how women who are like her, this would be a college-educated woman, oftentimes when they were done with college, they would simply get married and have kids and really do nothing with their college degree, do nothing with their brains, and how depressed they became, and they didn't really understand what was wrong with them. They had these perfect lives with houses and material success and children and so on, but they were depressed. They had this so-called problem that has no name. Well, the problem that she was describing is women not being psychologically fulfilled by lives as wives and mothers in the 1950s and 1960s and so on. So once again, allowing women post 1968 to have all kinds of new opportunities and be equal to men is really what she was talking about. Well, the situation of women did alter dramatically, starting with 1968 into the 1970s. The counterculture of sex, drugs, rock and roll, everything that is changing in the 1970s and into the 1980s led to really women becoming much more equal to men. More equal pay for equal work. It's not completely there yet, but we're getting there. The access to abortion, access to divorce, access to childcare and job protections for women who wanted to work, wanted to protect their careers, wanted to be career women in addition to being mothers. And we find too in much of Europe there are some female politicians and some female business leaders, really more politicians than business leaders. And a couple of notable examples of them would be Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain for a good decade, and Angela Merkel, who has been the Chancellor of Germany for for more than a decade as well. Very powerful women in very large and influential states. Finally, I'm going to end up here with talking about a number of different art movements very quickly. You might remember that my overall thesis for art throughout the year has been that art is a reflection of the period of time that it is made in. And in the early parts of the 20th century, there was an anti-art movement called Dadaism, Marcel Duchamp is a primary example of this kind of artist. And what they're doing as an anti-art movement, it's kind of like art had been played out after all of the different art movements that existed in European history. And they started to do a kind of joke art or, anti-art and pretty much doing whatever they wanted to do. They were not no longer looking at trying to be objective and having one standard of art or one standard of beauty or what have you, but they just started to do whatever they wanted. And so you can see on the left, this is I'm sorry, it's disgusting. I know it's called Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, and you can clearly see a naked bride and a bunch of bachelors there on the left, or not. Anyway, Dadaism is kind of just creating whatever. On the right, we also have, excuse me, blatant nudity, but this is nude descending stairs. And once again, it's kind of a way of showing odd movement and an abstract kind of painting. It is whatever the artist wants to make it. It is freeing them completely. It's kind of like existentialism in a weird way, where the artist is choosing to portray whatever it is they want to portray in their own way. Because civilized standards, rational standards, the things that have been traditional had all failed. They created world wars and genocides and things like that. So Dadaism. Nazi art goes back to a much more realistic, I'm saying that in quotes, form of art. I like to say that Nazi art is all about Aryans, Adolf, and eagles, and you can see that it is much more real in the terms of portraying things like the Nazis would like them to look, I suppose. We've got a lot of human bodies, a lot of naked human bodies, sort of a return to the old Renaissance art in a way, based off of Greco-Roman statues, trying to show healthy Aryan people, the so-called master race. You've got also this painting, it's kind of kitschy, of this Aryan farm family, and the mother is doing what mothers should be doing, having lots of kids, breastfeeding her kid, and even has kind of a farmer tan that we can see there. And then you've got a bunch of eagles and swastikas. The symbology of Nazism was ever present, as was the Führer cult of Adolf Hitler, a bust of Hitler, and kind of this sassy pose of Hitler in the middle of things. So I think that really typifies what was going on in Germany between 1933 and 1945 with Nazism. If we go to communism, the communist world, they had something called socialist realism in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it really tries to portray peasants and workers as, some of the most important people in the state, or for whom the hammer and sickle state is made, and looking at their dignity and that kind of thing. But then also, of course, you have to have the cult of personality of Lenin, top left, or Stalin, bottom right. We also saw some paintings earlier of Stalin hanging out with little kids, just denoting the importance of young people in totalitarian states as well. Also very, as it says, socialist realism, also very realistic looking in terms of how things look, maybe not so much in the subject matter, but so be it. Surrealism is something that's going on at that same period of time, but not in these totalitarian states. Salvador Dali is a main figure in surrealism. Once again, it's all about how the war had shaken people's faith in what was real, in what was, part of civilization or society. And this is really, surrealism is looking at how the mind is really quite powerful, kind of like what Freud was talking about, subconscious fantasies, dreams, and so on, trying to figure out what is reality, for example, and we don't even really particularly know. The search for subconscious forces that mold reality are a part of surrealism. this thing with the droopy clocks, maybe showing us that time is not a constant thing. That time and space are relative, like Einstein said. This is called the persistence of memory. What is memory really? How real is that? How real is our existence? Surrealism is showing us that that people just aren't really certain anymore. Also, there's Cubism, going back to the earlier parts of the 20th century, and it's taking natural shapes, real shapes, and turning them into different kinds of forms like cylinders and spheres and cones to once again create what the artist wants things to look like, and not necessarily them being what they really do look like. And some people look at this and say, well, the reason why these cones, these cylinders, these spheres, or so on, it's kind of a robotic image of man. Man is no longer part of nature. Man has become just part of industry. And so after a century of industrialism, then this maybe makes more sense. Portray man as machine rather than maybe natural person. But you have a Guernica there on the right. That was the bombing of a Spanish town during the Spanish Civil War by German warplanes. And you can see the horrors of what happened under that. Once again, it's what Picasso, main proponent of Cubism, is just trying to portray. It doesn't have to look real by any means. It is just the way that the artist wants to look at things. 20th century art really is about what the individual artists wanted to portray, and they painted it in any way that they want to, or they sculpted it in any way that they want to. And people are just simply questioning what had come from the past. What is art anyway? It is not something objective, let's say, that everyone can agree what good art is or what beautiful art is or so on. It's really up to the creator. It's up to the beholder. It's kind of going from an objective knowledge kind of thing from the Renaissance and beyond to a more subjective vision of people doing whatever they want. Sometimes nowadays there are people who splash a dot of color on a big white canvas and call it art, and then there are investors who buy it for hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. But that's just my take on it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope you enjoyed all of the lectures over the year. Wish that I could have given them live to you. Have a great day.